In this lecture, we examine how to develop attribute-based perceptual maps. The learning objectives of this module are to define and explain segmentation, targeting, and positioning, to explain positioning companies and markets, to identify different positioning tools such as preference maps, and the subject of this lecture is to execute positioning using perceptual maps. Developing perceptual maps is a 5-step process, starting with identifying the selection criteria, conducting market surveys, graphing the data, formatting the data, and interpreting the map. We discuss each step in turn. In the first step, we determine what evaluation criteria consumers use when they select and purchase products and services. For example, if I'm purchasing a new cell phone, I would consider screen size, battery length, and other factors when deciding which one to buy. This slide shows some typical criteria and the polar opposites for each. For example, if style is a criterion, some people might prefer a traditional style, which we could designate on the survey as a score of 1 on a 10-point scale, and some people might prefer a fashionable style, which we could designate as a 10 on a 10-point scale. Someone between those two extremes would rate a 4, 5, or a 6. Similarly, degree of ruggedness sought could vary from delicate and fine to rugged and durable. We can add other criteria such as size, economic orientation, and comfort orientation as needed. How do we find out all those criteria? Well, that's the subject of the next slide. To find the criteria consumers use to evaluate products and services, we generally start by conducting secondary research to find the terminology consumers use, as well as their typical purchasing behavior. We often look at existing reviews, such as those done by J.D. Powers, Consumer Reports, and online evaluation websites, to find what people are looking for when they buy certain products and services. Typically, we'd also conduct primary research using customer interviews, focus groups, behavioral tests, and other means to learn firsthand how people evaluate products and services. Now that we know the evaluation criteria consumers use to purchase products and services, we conduct a market survey to determine how they perceive competing brands. Just to be clear, we often need to conduct 2 market surveys, one to find out the criteria, and another one to find out how different brands rate against those criteria. In this slide, we show the results of a market survey done for competing brands of household blenders at about the $40 to $60 price point. The 2 evaluation criteria were features and effective power. A score of 1 on features meant that it had few features, whereas a score of 10 meant that it had many features. A score of 1 on effective power meant that it crushed ice very slowly, whereas a score of 10 meant it crushed ice very, very quickly. Again, the data presented in this chart represents the perceptions held by consumers who completed the survey. For example, consumers felt that the Cuisinart BFP-703CH model had many features and moderate power, whereas the Waring WPB80BC had few features and high effective power. In step 3, we plot the data. In Microsoft Excel, we would highlight the data table, click on Insert Graph, and select the XY scatter plot graph type. The result is a simple XY scatter plot with each point representing consumer perception for a particular brand of blender. This graph is technically accurate, but needs some formatting work to make it a more effective communication tool. In step 4, we format the graph. We start by removing any existing legends and removing the horizontal grid lines and axis values. We add labels for each brand using the text box function from the Insert tab. We bring out the outline of the graph more clearly by drawing a big rectangle over the entire plot and then clicking on the No Fill option. We then draw 4 equal-sized rectangles within the big rectangle we just drew. In some cases, we might wish to highlight a particular quadrant by adding shading, such as we see in the graph in the high-power, feature-rich quadrant on the upper right. In step 5, we interpret our perceptual map. We see that several brands are competing in the basic features high-power quadrant. We notice that some brands are perceived very similar to each other, such as KitchenAid and Black & Decker, because they're near each other on the map. We also notice that some quadrants have only one brand, such as Sunbeam in the lower left and Cuisinart in the lower right. Being alone in a quadrant can be desirable because it means that consumers perceive you to be the only brand with that combination of attributes. For example, if you were a chef who wanted many features, you could be naturally drawn toward the Cuisinart. You would not perceive the blenders in the other quadrants as relevant substitutes. The blank quadrant on the upper right poses a challenge. The quadrant could represent a new opportunity where somehow all existing brands never thought of building a high-power, feature-rich blender, or it could represent an unprofitable venture where such a machine would cost too much to make. Whenever we see blank spaces, we must ask ourselves, why? In our final slide for this lecture, we check for understanding. After reviewing the material, you should know the definitions of segmentation, targeting, and positioning, and the advantages we gain from each. You should also be able to explain positioning and repositioning. We can apply different tools to different situations, and you should know how to apply which when. Lastly, take the time to practice developing perceptual maps on your own so you gain understanding on their creation and use. They can be very helpful, especially in today's crowded, competitive markets.